have with us sci-fi author Greg Bear, who's also contributed to several rather big novel universes. But we're going to start right at the very beginning because we have some listeners who absolutely love your work, and they just want to know what got you into writing hardcore science fiction, not just science fiction, but hardcore deep science fiction.
Well, I started writing when I was 8 years old, and science fiction was about the coolest thing out there. This would be in the 1960s. Actually, 1950s when I was 8. But by the 1960s, I was cranking out all sorts of science fiction, fantasy, even a little horror now and then. And so I would send these stories out and get responses, and I never actually sold to John W. Campbell at Analog, but I did get rejection slips from him, and that was pretty cool. I got all these rejection slips. Among the first stories I sold, one was a fantasy and one was science fiction. And very shortly thereafter, I was interested in black holes back in the 1970s when they were in their heyday. And so I wrote a story called The Venging, which ended up in Galaxy. And then I wrote other science fiction stories, and this seemed to be a perfect fit for me. I continue to write and still do to this day fantasy and occasionally a horror story, but science fiction is, I think, the most satisfying in terms of social impact.
So when it comes to the hard science fiction novels, science, or at least predicting the future of science, plays a major role, with the Asimovs and so on. How much research do you need to do in order to be able to pump out the science fiction of the quality that you do, as far as when it comes to science, or at least predicting what people are thinking science is going to do?
Well, I'm reading all the time. I try to keep up on all the journals and have since I was a kid. So I've always been reading either New Scientist or Science News or Science or Nature, whatever's in front of me. I'm trying to catch up, and usually there's something in every single issue that really strikes my fancy because science is constantly on the move. So what you thought you knew, 4 years ago, is suddenly being amended. And so keeping up with kind of the gossipy trend lines of science is it's like sports. You're keeping up with personalities, with research, with topics and subjects, but you're also keeping up with the universe. And so nowadays, in the days of YouTube and 4K video and everything, I can get on my TV and watch these amazing NASA recreations of all of their data that they're getting from their space probes, from the Earth, from Mars, from Pluto, and watch these things, in a way that would have knocked my socks off when I was a kid. Or if you think about when astronomy was really in its golden age in the 1920s and 30s, discovering the size of the universe, when Clyde Tombaugh was finding Pluto, what would they have thought to see Pluto in the kind of detail we can now? So science marches on, as the old cliche puts it, but also the people in science keep changing and developing and growing and adding new things. Science fiction is cool. It is fun to work with science and science fiction, but I always have to remember the scientists are the ones doing the heavy lifting. Particularly now, we're getting the outer planets looked at pretty closely, and then we hear about, the ninth planet out there. That's been a kind of a goal for science since the 1900s at least. Percival Lowell set Clyde Tombaugh out to look for this supposed ninth planet that might explain the perturbations of the orbit of Neptune. And he found Pluto, but that didn't explain the perturbations of Neptune's orbit. So as I write my science fiction novel, this is volume 3 now of the War Dogs trilogy, calling it Take Back the Sky, I'm talking about that ninth planet. It's way out there. And then a story pops up in the news this last couple of weeks. They've done a computer simulation that points toward the ninth planet. So that thing's been going, that whole idea has been going on for at least 100 years now. It's so utterly cool to think it could really be out there.
So for people who would just, who like science fiction, who maybe can't afford to buy all the hardcore magazines, but is there places you'd recommend they go just to get a basis of the type of science that a lot of writers use in their writing?
There's all kinds of places on the web. There's, as I said, there's videos on YouTube that you can follow. Astrum is a very good source for news about astronomy. It's a very good videos, well edited. ASTRUM. I've enjoyed his work. There's Science News, which is fairly inexpensive. I believe they have a web presence. A lot of these magazines, like New Scientist and so on, have a web presence that you can dip into. But there's all these preprint articles and scientific papers and so on that end up on university websites or on personal websites. And if you start doing a good Google search on subjects of interest to you, you're going to find a lot of material. Plus, a lot of this stuff gets picked up. If it's in Nature, it's going to get picked up by a newspaper or a press reporter or a website or whatever very shortly if it's an interesting story. So I think just dip in, do a search on anything that interests you. And Wikipedia is actually a pretty good source nowadays. A lot of people are editing and correcting Wikipedia. And so I found it to be pretty reliable, and that's cool. At least as reliable as old encyclopedias used to be, and maybe a lot more up to date.
So you mentioned how science is always changing and how, as the research goes, things are advancing. This is based on a listener question. They want to know if your research in the 70s on black holes, when the Disney's Black Hole came out, did you see that movie, and were you aghast or impressed with what they were able to do with that research?
I have an interesting relationship with the black hole. A friend of mine was working at Disney Studios at that point doing illustration, and he alerted me to the fact that they were having some difficulties with what they were calling Space Probe 1 at that point. So I actually called up the studio and got interviews with a wonderful group of people, including John Mansbridge and Peter Ellenshaw Sr., and actually met Ron Miller, who was the head of the studio at that point, and briefly ran into the screenwriter for the black hole. And what I wanted to tell them, well, I know more about what they look like than I should. I painted pictures, portraits of black holes, and so here's what they look like, and here's how you could describe them. And they were very nice. They were very interested. And at one point or another, I tried to help them with their storyline, but that didn't work out. I was only 24 years old. There's an old line studio, a lot of top-notch people. But the fun thing about that was I got to sit in Peter Ellenshaw Sr.'s studio as he was doing the paintings for the black hole. He's one of the premier matte painters and designers and influential creative talents at Disney. It was like being in a old master's studio. It was just amazing. That alone was a privilege. I didn't like the movie, but that wasn't Ellenshaw's fault. And at that time period, Disney was doing a lot of interesting films. They ended up doing Tron, which was not financially successful at that time, but it was an amazingly influential film. So Disney was kind of hit or miss at that point, but boy, was it good to get into the studio and meet those old talents.
Fantastic story there. We're going to go to a listener question, which I know this is a topic that you could talk about. You've mentioned a lot that Ray Bradbury is the most influential writer in your life, and you've met him and you've had a lifelong correspondence with him. What drew you to Ray Bradbury, and which are your favorite of his stories that really inspired you?
Well, I started reading Ray Bradbury probably when I was 10 or 11 years old, and just found his stories both, fantastic and compelling and haunting, and all the things necessary. The one thing that I grew up with was the whole Twilight Zone group of writers who were really drawing on a lot of Ray Bradbury's themes and moods. Rod Serling set up the Twilight Zone, did an amazing job for 5 seasons. And all of those shows took different writers like Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont and George Clayton Johnson and just so many great writers of the time period, and gave them a chance to appear in half-hour scripted shows, which are classics to this day. Now, all those writers were influenced by Ray Bradbury, and I realized there was this kind of a group of writers around Bradbury. And in a way, in the 1960s, late 1960s, I first met Ray and became the next generation of a group of writers. A lot of us would come out to his house or to his office and get together. Ray was very accessible. As a bunch of teenagers showed up at his office one time, he took us all out to Frascati's in Beverly Hills to have hamburgers and so on. And he picked up the tab. I mean, that was fabulous. And here we were, 17 and 18 years old, and then he got us studio passes to go into Warner Brothers and see the premiere of The Illustrated Man and all that sort of stuff. Well, in paying it back to Ray, we invited him to attend this little event that we were trying to put on, which we were going to call the Golden State Comic-Con. It became San Diego Comic-Con. And in 1970, he was at the first of these events, which had like 200 people. And we all went out to a cafeteria nearby and had dinner afterwards and had a wonderful time. Ray loved it. He loved the whole idea. San Diego Comic-Con became his favorite place to go each year. And I think he attended nearly all of them up through 2011. And he was a fabulous presence and a fabulous entertainer there. but he was also a great writer. And for me, science fiction, I have so many favorite writers, it's hard to say. But the poles of my enthusiasm run from Arthur C. Clarke to Ray Bradbury and nearly all the spectrums in between. And so to know that there was a community of people that helped raise Ray Bradbury fascinated me. The Los Angeles Science Fiction Society was a group of enthusiasts who still meet to this day in a clubhouse in Los Angeles. And Ray was involved with them back in the 1930s and 40s. But the connections in Southern California from Bradbury outward were just amazing to me because Corey Ackerman, an old-time fan, was one of the older fans who helped, keep Ray in control and encourage him. There was also Ray Harryhausen, who was of the same time period, same age as Ray. And they became good friends. And Harryhausen would show Ray his movies, his models, his stop-motion animation work. And Bradbury, would talk about writing and stories. And eventually, they kind of ended up collaborating on Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. So there's all these stories back and forth, getting to visit studios, actually we drove Ray to Cascade Studios in the late 1960s. And later on in the 80s, I drove Ray to Digital Productions. Cascade Studios was stop motion animation. Digital Productions was working on The Last Starfighter in the early 80s. And I took Ray there to see how they're using computers to do the kind of animation that might have at one time been done with stop motion. So the whole trend of Southern California, as I witnessed it through friends and through Bradbury and through all kinds of connections down there, one of my old friends was Phil Tippett. We were 16 years old together when we first met. And Phil was working on a Ray Bradbury short story called The Sound of Thunder with a friend of his, Bill Stromberg. And I got to see their studio and the dinosaurs and all the stuff they were doing. And Ray and Phil would exchange sculptures and ideas. So all of this was just a ferment of what was going to be happening. In the 1980s, of course, they were just getting started with the revolution that would put an end to dinosaurs as stop-motion animated creatures and bring about Jurassic Park. Now that's kind of where Phil Tippett became part of that entire story. He was started out doing stop-motion animation for Jurassic Park and ended up helping guide the digital productions, which transformed his entire studio. So that whole period is an amazing period in history. The science fiction stories, the literature, the development, Rod Serling and the dramatic approach to all of these things, all of these writers, Richard Matheson, probably one of the most influential writers of our time, so many movies and wonderful stories. George Clayton Johnson, who had 8 Twilight Zone episodes and a lot of stories and helped create Ocean's 11. And all of that, Johnson just died recently, which was very sad for us because he was also a constant at San Diego Comic-Con. And as kids, he would show up and we'd go to parties in his room, and he seemed to be a kid just like us, except he was an incredibly accomplished kid. And that was true of nearly all of the people in Ray Bradbury's circle.
I think this will be a perfect tie-in for what James really wants to talk about. So, James, I'm going to pass it to you.
No, absolutely. It kind of touched on that because, knowing, having done the research and knowing exactly who you are. Jeremiah likes to give me some stuff about that every now and then. But, yeah, he likes to. But, knowing that you were one of the guys, that helped to found the San Diego Comic-Con, it's interesting to hear about, the Ray Bradbury connection in the beginning. But well, I was curious, how did that come about? Why did you guys decide to do that to begin with?
Well, I was on the periphery in a lot of ways. There was a group of older guys who came in from New York and started to live in San Diego, and fans always tend to cluster together. So we'd go out to Ken Kruger's bookstore and see what was going on. My friends at that point, we were all congregated in one high school, kind of a black hole of science fiction fandom at Crawford High School in San Diego. There was me, there was David Clark, there was Scott Shaw, there was John Pound, Roger Friedman was part of our group. And all of these guys were heavy-duty fans and also just very, very knowledgeable people. David Clark was one of the guys who introduced me to a lot of this stuff, got me to see Ray Bradbury in '67. Scott Shaw was a cartoonist and a talented guy, and we first met in junior high school. And all of us got together at Crawford High School, and these older fans, we would go out and visit them. Scott was a big comic collector and fan, and so he would get together with the comic book artists and underground comic artists, and there was that aspect of it. When they decided they'd want to put on a convention, then we'd get together with the older fans, and they had the plan and the ideas and some of the experience. Whereas a lot of our people, like Mike Towery and who is still running Comic Fest in San Diego, a lot of our other fans were enthusiastic or could drive a car or had a bank account. So all of that came together, and we said, let's put on a small convention and see what happens. And they did the hard work, and I tried to bring in guests and probably, helped contact Ray Bradbury, and David Clark got involved, and Scott Shaw was there working hard, and Mike Towery, and just a whole group of us. John Pound, artist, was heavily involved at that point. We were all friends. We all knew each other, and with the order and organization provided by some of the more experienced fans, then we had an organization that could put together a convention. So we held it in the basement of the U.S. Grant Hotel in, I believe, 1970 was the first tryout convention. There might have been something preliminary, a party or something in 69. About 70, and we had 200 people show up, and Bradbury was there, and we had Jack Kirby, and a lot of artists were there, younger and older and experienced, and they had a ball. Within a few years, people like Bill Lund were running the business aspects of the convention, and we had all kinds of more guests showing up. By the 1970s, early 1970s, 1973, 74, we were at the Cortez Hotel, which is an apartment building now. But that was the golden age of Comic-Con. And the thing about Comic-Con that was amazing at that point is you could walk into the lobby to get your membership, and there would be Clarence Ducky Nash with a duck under his arm, the voice of Donald Duck. Or over here in the green room, Chuck Jones would be doing sketches for people, of all of his cartoon characters. And then Gene Roddenberry would show up on another side here. Or later on, you'd have the Star Wars people come by and run a preview of the film for the Comic-Con people. Through the 1970s, Comic-Con maintained at about 3,500 people or thereabouts. It's important. In the 80s, it started to bloom. It got larger. Conventions all over the world were getting larger, in part because of the impact of not just the science fiction book renaissance, but movies like Star Wars, 2001, TV shows like Star Trek. All of these things were drawing in lots of fans. So the conventions got larger. By the early 1980s, Comic-Con was in the 10,000 range. And of course, within another 15 years, it was going to be 150,000. And it just, started to take over downtown San Diego, which is funny because in the early 1980s, the San Diego City Council was kind of determined to try and oust Comic-Con. They didn't want all these comic book nerds ruining the image of downtown San Diego by wandering around in their T-shirts.
That's actually really quite funny. That's too funny. They sit there and they go, oh, we don't want these nerdy guys here. And then meanwhile, biggest business boon to the city.
Well, when they express their opinions, to the hotel people, they says, "Wait a minute, you want to kill 10,000 room nights in the middle of summer?" So the hotel people had the right idea, and then it became 100,000 room nights or 70,000 or something in that range. It was like San Diego Comic-Con was going to run downtown for the summer, and to this day, it's a favorite part of San Diego heritage.
Yeah, well, it's something that California seems to do when they don't like something. Like, not that we want to bring sports into this, but look what LA did when they had 2 football teams at one time and then said nope. And now they had none, and they had none for 20 years. And oops. But that's a pretty awesome story. Because now San Diego Comic-Con, of course, is very different. It's not really the book place anymore or the artist place. It's like the media.
It's kind of like a media central where all like the really, really, really big, super important things kind of go down, and then you get everything else like the various cons that you've got going on now. I mean, because God, they're everywhere.
Well, up here we have Emerald City Comic-Con, which is getting larger and more impressive year by year. And in San Diego, the original intent of San Diego Comic-Con was we were all enthusiastic about everything. talk about shotgun fandom. We just loved everything, and so we wanted all of it to be part of what we did at Comic-Con. Comics was still prevailed. I mean, there was, you had Jack Kirby for God's sake. So we had all of these mentors and helpers and enthusiastic people and talents, but we really wanted to concentrate on everything. So San Diego Comic-Con was wide open for doing the media stuff. I think that comes out of the huge success that media started to feel in regard to science fiction subjects. And so Comic-Con became the perfect place to introduce science fiction films, horror films, etc. But also later on, of course, the superhero films really started to take off, probably beginning with Superman the movie in the late 1970s. And thereafter, certainly today, superhero films are huge, and so they fit in naturally to comic books.
So we're just going to backtrack just a little bit. You mentioned the Twilight Zone with a lot of them being inspired by Ray Bradbury, but is it true that there was a Twilight Zone episode from the 80s that was actually based on one of your stories?
Yeah, this was the second generation Twilight Zone, and interestingly, I wrote a story called Dead Run, which was rejected by Twilight Zone magazine at the time. And they said, this really isn't a Twilight Zone story. So I said, okay. And I sold it to Omni, and it got a little more money and got spread around. And then a friend of mine named Mike Tolman took it over to another friend of mine named Alan Brenner, old-time friend of mine, a screenwriter and writer. And he was working on the Twilight Zone TV show at that point. And so take a look at that story, Dead Run. I think it's just right for the Twilight Zone. Well, Alan agreed and got a script going and had it purchased and produced. And so I got to watch this story that had been rejected by Twilight Zone magazine be done on the Twilight Zone show.
Shows them right.
Yeah, well, it was a very interesting story, but not easy to imagine. It's about union truck drivers taking souls to hell. And it worked. I mean, we had a great time. I get to watch them filming it and building sets and hang out with extras, and it was just a lovely experience.
And of course, that's not the only big multimedia universe you've been involved in. You've written in, if I recall right, you've done Halo, you've done Star Trek, and you've done Star Wars. Are there any other universes that I have forgotten to mention?
Well, actually, with Gregory Benford and David Brin wrote in the Foundation universe.
Oh, wow, Asimov's series. Yeah,
we did the new Foundation Trilogy in the 1990s, and those books sold quite well, and it was great fun to do them, and I wish I'd been able to collaborate with Isaac more directly, but had a great time working in his universe.
So how do you get permission or get added into writing into the Foundation universe, which is Asimov's baby from the 60s, I think, when that first came out, right?
Yeah, it was from the 50s actually. 1940s and 50s was when he was writing the original novellas and stories. And I think it was voted the most popular series of all time in the 1970s. But how it happened was that Gregory Benford was talking to Janet Asimov, Isaac's widow, and suggested maybe, this was a good idea to do a new version of the Foundation and bring them out in 3 volumes. And he suggested us 3 writers. Janet was very generous and very enthusiastic. And so we got a contract with the publisher and went ahead and did this. And because working with Benford and Brin is like working between 2 elephants, I squeezed my book into the week in between their 2 books. I really wanted to open up the Foundation Trilogy, my version of the Foundation Trilogy, kind of where Isaac started his. They had other ideas, and I think David Brin managed to expand it to nearly the entire Asimov universe.
Wow. And so, out of the series that you've been able to write in, you've been able to join in with the Foundation. You had to work with other people. You've done Halo, where you really had to work with, I guess, Microsoft or 347 Studios by then. Star Trek, yeah. 343, Star Trek, and Star Wars. Which one would you say was the easiest for you just to be able to insert your ideas and stories in as far as how much freedom they give you?
Well, I never had much problem, which was fascinating. When I wrote the Star Trek book, it was early 80s. They were just transforming their notions of what Star Trek was going to be. I've actually had lunch with Gene Roddenberry in 1977 or 78 and was discussing with him and got into, with Alan Brenner, to try and write a script for the new TV show they were planning, the Star Trek TV show. But then they transformed it into Star Trek the motion picture. So the TV show was put aside for the moment, and our script was put aside, and I didn't develop fabulous career as a screenwriter. Alan went on to do so for a lot of different shows, but I went off and wrote books instead. So that was fascinating to be. I've always been a Star Trek fan. Saw the first episode air in 1966, was it, on Los Angeles television. So all of these influences lead me to think I could write a Star Trek novel. And when I wrote it, I told myself, okay, what's great about Star Trek? We can keep that stuff. What doesn't quite work nowadays? Well, you can't say he's dead, Jim, if you have a transporter room that can keep a record of you, right? So I started, working these themes in to the Star Trek novel, which was called Corona. And later on, they kind of thought similar thoughts, and when they did the Next Generation, they updated the whole Star Trek milieu. And it's been a really interesting experience to work in different universes because they all have different moods, different creative requirements. And for some reason, I find it fairly easy to fit myself into the moods and requirements of an entire universe or subgenre like Star Wars. I understood Star Wars right away. As soon as it came out, I was a fan. I loved the special effects. I knew people who'd worked on the special effects, and never actually got to meet George Lucas, but was able to write that book pretty quickly because they gave me the opportunity to write about Darth Vader as a young kid, and that was pretty extraordinary. And they didn't change much, so I guess I either fit in. Or I know how to write in the universe that they're describing.
So when it comes to your Star Wars book, Rogue Planet, I remember at that time, Vector Prime had just come out. Chewbacca had died. There was in the newspaper, and people were freaking out. Yeah. And then this little book with Anakin on the cover, Kid Anakin on the cover, came out, and I read it, and I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to get back to this New Jedi Order series, only to find out like a year or two later that everything in this book that you wrote is connected to that series. And then I had to go back to it and figure out, oh, I missed all this stuff. Now it's all connected. I didn't, because when it came out, I didn't realize the connection, because those connections didn't really pop up until probably a year or two later when the New Jedi Order got a little further on, and you realized, this has started way back then.
They let me have some freedom, but they also wanted me to put some things in, so I was able to put in some subject matter that would get developed later on. The one thing I did create on my own that they used a lot later on was this planet called Zonoma Sakot, which I guess ended up in dozens of Star Trek novels thereafter. If you
that was a very important
planet,
that was a very important Star Wars planet that they used. Yeah,
I was the first to do that, and they didn't tell me to write that, so I guess I created Zonoma Sakot.
What was your influence for that planet? What drew you to want to do it, or is it just the hardcore sci-fi in you that, like, why not?
Well, it's not really hardcore sci-fi. It's pulp. It's space opera. It's the grandiose, glorious joy of writing about huge spaceships and traveling through the stars and so on. I take it back to when I was reading Doc Smith, Edward E. Smith, back in the 1950s and 60s. The origin of a lot of Star Wars comes out of those classic pulps, and to some extent, there's a fair amount of Isaac Asimov, the Foundation series, in the Star Wars universe. And so they were able to be inspired by it and give it a visual magnificence, which hasn't been, exceeded since the time of the science fiction magazine covers back in the day. Giant spaceships, planets blowing up, Frank R. Paul illustrations, all that stuff leads to what we love today as Star Wars.
Fantastic. And so how does writing for Star Trek and Star Wars universes, which were created first on film, and a lot of people could really relate to them, and the universes grew, and by the time you got to write them, it had grown a lot. How is that different than writing in, say, Halo, which started as a video game, which is a very different market, very different visual type market, which then turned into, well, now there's quite a lot of books, there's TV series, there are several TV series, actually, and several DVDs, and a lot of games. Is there any difference in writing in that universe?
Well, it's a different requirement. A video game universe, they gave me the opportunity not to actually write in the video game universe, but to create the origin story for Halo, which was a real privilege. And they had some vague ideas put in by the original game creators, by Bungie and folks, but they hadn't developed them. And so they said, okay, here's what we've got. What can you do? And my son was a big Halo player. Eric there was my guide to the Halo universe by showing me the games and playing through with me and so on. And in our first meeting, Eric went with me, and we hung out with the Halo people, team of 343 on Microsoft, and And Eric told me before we went in and had breakfast with him, he says, what your Forerunner needs is a human sidekick. And that was such a fascinating idea that when I pitched it to them, they basically said, well, wait a minute, we have to think about that. And then, in a few minutes, we had almost the entire arc of this origin story for Halo. And so it was collaboration, but also they gave me a tremendous amount of freedom. And that's what I've required when I work in these other universes. Well, I don't just want to write down, novelize a screenplay or something. I wanted to give them a chance to play in the field that they've helped put together.
And so when you wrote in the Halo, you actually wrote 3 books, which is quite impressive. Is there anything that you were able to bring yourself to the Halo universe that you can actually say that you did yourself, like you did Zimana Zikad in Star Wars?
Well, in a sense, the whole notion of the Cryptum, which was the name of the game that came out afterwards, and of my first novel, the notion of the way the Forerunners appeared, how they developed, their society, their history, their interactions with human beings. Well, I worked with all of the Halo creators. They basically just kind of said, that's cool, let's work with that. And then they would take those elements and put them in the game. So the first 2 books I had a tremendous amount of freedom. By the time I was writing the 3rd book, they were creating the first Microsoft Halo game. And they were using the Didact as a major character, and in the physical form that I described him, there were other appearances and bits of history being actually kind of directly done in the game from the novel, which was amazing to watch. And I had to tighten down a little bit and follow their lead because for some reason, as they're putting, I don't know, 150 or $200 million into this game, they just don't want to have me run free in volume 3. They want to connect everything up. And we did. Worked out well, and then there was some concern when the first book came out that Halo fans who had long been, interested in developing the creation story themselves, but they'd be very resentful that this has been done by the Halo team. But in fact, they loved it, and I got a lot of fan mail and had to answer questions, and it just became almost immediately incorporated into the Halo encyclopedias. Everything I was writing down was like writing canon, which was wonderful. And of course, I've been raised on people like Larry Niven and so on, who helped create the ring world that we see so much of in Halo. And so, to me, it was okay. I get to play with ring worlds. That's cool. I'll throw a moon through one of them and see what happens.
That's awesome. So, has the fan reaction to these franchises that you worked in, has it pretty much all been solid and positive?
I would say 98% of it. I call it Stalinist levels of approval. So I'm sure there have been people out there who have griped, but I don't hear it. No one sends email to me that's very few, 1 or 2 maybe, that's critical. And I think a lot of young readers just were totally enamored, and they said, well, where do you get this stuff? And I said, we call it science fiction. I've read a lot of stuff. Here's a list of authors you can read. And you can start here with Doc Smith, Jack Williamson, Paul Anderson, Jack Vance. You can move on from them to, the people who inspired everybody back in the 1930s, from H.G. Wells to Olaf Stapledon. Just kind of opened up a lot of Halo people who were very much good gamers and very much interested in the strategies and tactics of the game, to the literature that helped create those games in the minds of the Halo creators.
I've been told from a lot of Star Wars authors who I've interviewed, especially ones who write one book or join in a bit later, that they're usually given a warning that says, make sure people don't know exactly where to find you, because the fans are pretty hardcore and will send you lots of messages, whether they like your book or not, and there'll be lots of fan mail. Was that true for you when you joined the Star Wars universe, or because your book kind of just, honestly, really snuck in there at a time when there was tons of books that's coming out at the same time, that it wasn't as big of a swarm of the letters from the fans for Star Wars?
Well, it was fun, and it was fun to get out to Skywalker Ranch and meet all the LucasArts people and see the artwork and the artifacts there that were on display at Skywalker Ranch. That was fun. But no, I never had any problem dealing with fans. For some reason, fans are very respectful around our group. The thing is that I've already written a lot of science fiction. I've won awards. I've written a lot of original novels. Those books have been purchased, optioned for movies. We've got a very good project going on now that we could possibly talk about sometime in the next 6 or 7 months. And so there's already a steady record of my fans. And I think they tolerate me dabbling in Star Wars and Star Trek. Certainly Star Trek was back in the early days. But by 1985, 86, 87, I was selling millions of books of my own. And so that was, it was more of a hobby. By the time I got around to doing the Star Wars novel, it was actually an interim novel while my publisher, Random House, was trying to figure out what to do with Darwin's Radio. When Darwin's Radio became a pretty big seller and then won a Nebula Award, they wanted me to do not more Star Wars books, but, Darwin's Children, sequels and other books. By the time that Halo came along, it was a really interesting proposition because I've always been fascinated by the video gaming universe and the culture and the technology. I met a lot of these people over the years. And I said, okay, let's see what we can do here. Let's see how we can take and combine classic science fiction, classic history, classic anthropology, science, and all that stuff and help create the origin story for Halo. It's been a privilege working on these things, but they don't interfere with my getting my own books done and getting attention there. So I actually have two solid careers. I don't have to stick with media. I can write my own books and make money. I can write the media books. I generally found that if I write my own books, I actually make a little more money than if I write a tie-in novel. And that's always been kind of gratifying. Is tie-in novels are meat and potatoes, but my own books can, I own them, I control them, I can sell the rights to them, I can sell foreign rights, all that sort of thing. So I do pretty well with my own books.
Awesome. So, James, do you have any more questions before I begin asking the last few?
No, but I do have to comment. I like the way that you put that. It's like, this is the meat and potatoes. My stuff, that's the filet mignon.
Well, the filet mignon is actually the people who inspired us all. I'm a huge fan of science fiction history, the origins of all of these ideas. And I go back and people I've met in the 60s and 70s who were just such amazing brains, not just Ray Bradbury, but his friend was Edmund Hamilton. Edmund Hamilton's wife was Lee Brackett. Edmund Hamilton wrote amazing adventure stories, science fiction stories, pulp magazine stories. Lee Brackett wrote movies. She wrote The Big Sleep with William Faulkner. And, she also went on to write the second Star Wars movie, which was finished off by Lawrence Kasdan after she died. So what a heritage there is there. The history is just astonishing. If you dig into it, you really get a sense of this overall family and culture that helps raise young kids to think large thoughts about the universe.
And at the same time, isn't your father-in-law, who's now gone, but wasn't that Poe Anderson, who's also a pulp science fiction legend?
Absolutely, and not just pulp science fiction. Poe was one of the best writers out there and highly regarded. Won a shelf of awards, much bigger than mine, and was one of my favorite writers. I started reading him when I was 13. Reading books like The High Crusade and Three Hearts and Three Lions. But later on in the 70s, read Pal Zero, perhaps one of the most amazing hard science fiction novels ever. Starships, science fiction. Robert Heinlein, met Robert Heinlein in the 80s, actually in the 70s. And it was my first real science fiction novel was Red Planet by Heinlein. So all that history sticks in my head, and I really am not just paying homage to them, but to the people they inspired, including Gene Roddenberry and George Lucas and all the Halo creators. These teams are really steeped in the history of science fiction. They know what they're doing.
So we have a listener question, and they're curious about the collection of short stories which you have coming out in April, Just Over the Horizon. They just want to know more information about it, like what type of short stories in it. Are these new stories, the paintings which are included in there? They just want to know more information about your upcoming April release.
Well, this is my complete stories, minus one story, which is still in an anthology called Future Vision, which is the Microsoft Research commemorative anthology, 25th anniversary. The rest of these stories in these collections, there'll be 3 of them from Open Road. A lot of my older paintings are used as cover art on them, which is cool, including the black hole painting I was talking about that I took into Disney. I think this first one has the black hole painting on the cover. Subsequent volumes will have some of my fantasy and surrealistic paintings. The stories were all written between 1970 and today. They are all of my stories, which were originally collected in the Tor volume of collected stories, with a couple more. I revised them all, copy edited them thoroughly, and we're putting them into the Open Road collections. And so a lot of the stories that are there are Hugo and Nebula winners, Blood Music is in there. My fantasy stories, if you want to find out more about those, you can find all of the fantasy stories here. It's a great privilege to have these stories continue to be reprinted. But now, in the electronic rights era, we can actually put my covers on them, which is great fun.
So now that you can control your things, are you going to be putting more of your paintings as covers of stories, or just more of your paintings out there for people to have?
There's a few that have gotten around. They've been, I did a lot of Ray Bradbury paintings back in the day, which we hoped to put together with a calendar. That never quite worked out. But did paintings, portraits of Ray, science fiction covers. One of my covers actually appears on Fantasy and Science Fiction in 1975. A big tempera painting that I did, and that was fun. I don't think we're going to actually be using them for covers that much, but if necessary, we can bring them back.
Okay, so we have one last question and then a request. The last question is the one that we give everyone. We're going to give you a chance to have the soapbox so that you can promote any appearances, any other books or projects that we might have missed, your website, if you have an Amazon store or anything like that one. Anything you wish to promote so people can find you out there, support your work. We're giving you the soapbox now to promote your stuff.
Well, I think you're going to be putting this out after San Diego Comics Fest, but I'll be in San Diego for the Comics Fest this next weekend. My website is gregbear.com. You're happy to drop by and leave messages if you'd like. I'm on Facebook and don't have an Amazon store yet, but that's a good place to get a hold of me is through my website.
Fantastic. And, of course, your next book releases that April one, correct, with the short stories?
Yeah, that'll be out in April, and then I'm putting together Take Back the Sky, which we hope will be out later this year, following the third volume of the War Dogs trilogy, which is War Dogs, Killing Titan, and Take Back the Sky.
Fantastic. That's awesome. So the last request we have is just so we can continue promoting this interview on other episodes, get people to come back to it and so on. We just would like a bumper if that's possible. Something along the lines of, hello, this is Greg Bear, author of, insert some books, and you're listening to Bombad Radio, or you can listen to me on Bombad Radio.
Okay.
Whenever you're ready.
Let's go. Hello, this is Greg Bear. I'm the author of Darwin's Radio, Blood Music, Eon, and a lot of other great books, including Killing Titan and Take Back the Sky coming out soon. Why don't you listen to me on Bombad Radio?
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for giving us so much of your time. This has been great. I love talking to science fiction authors. Honestly, I think the one that makes myself most jealous that I've actually talked to is like Michael Moorcock for fantasy.
Oh, he's amazing, isn't he?
There's someone who can sit there and say, I met, like you were saying, you met Ray Bradbury, all these authors. Like someone who sits there and says, I know Tolkien, I know it's just the fact that these people still exist is amazing.
Yeah,
we're
still in the middle of history, aren't we?
Oh, yeah,
yep.
No, absolutely. I'm just still trying to get over the whole, Ray Bradbury took me out for a hamburger. That's amazing.
Took a bunch of us kids out for hamburgers, along with my grandmother. So, that was, Ray was unique.
That's too cool, though. Like, how many times do you meet anybody that can say that?
Mm-hmm. Well, whenever I would come down and do autographing in Los Angeles, Ray would come into the bookstore in his tennis shorts, and just the line of people waiting to get books signed would look at Ray and go, "Wait a minute, I didn't know he was going to be here." So bookstores learned if I was going to do a signing that they had to stock Ray's books so people could get those autographed, and Ray was just the king of Los Angeles at that point.
That's too funny, though. It's like, Ray, you're stealing my thunder, man.
No, it was great. We'd sit next to each other and chat while everybody was coming by in the line. So Ray would sign books, I would sign books. We all had a great time.
Oh, that's awesome.
I love that atmosphere because it's, some businesses, it's cutthroat. It's, this is mine. While when it comes to writers and, we talk to a lot of voice actors too, it's, we can all work together and make it better. Why not?
Absolutely, and that's part of the whole showbiz epic, isn't it?